the worse people are off in their housing situation, the worse they are off in terms of building energy.
Welcome. My name is Noélie and I'm your host on the Cost of Living podcast. As always, you're about to listen to live recordings of a call that we organized with the Gastavis Collective and CEO Corporate Europe Observatory. These calls are a space where we aim to bring together different actors of civil society to collectively make sense of the cost of living crisis that we're facing. And we use this space to try and come up with solutions that are not siloed, that don't just address energy on its own and then workers' rights on their own, but try and do it collectively. Today, you're listening to episode 4 on housing rights. We were joined by the crème de la crème of the housing right movement. We had 2 excellent speakers, Agnes, who's based in Budapest, Hungary, and Ioana, who's based in Bucharest, Romania. Together, Agnes and Ioana wrote a research piece called Contemporary Housing Struggles. First, Agnes is going to explain the main conclusions of the research. She's basically going to lay out the housing movement and how it is often split between 2 schools of thoughts and propose ways of moving beyond that split. Then you'll be hearing from Ioana, who's going to talk more from a local perspective. She's first going to just describe the housing situation in Romania and then explain how a group that she's part of, the Common Front for Housing Rights, tries to navigate the 2 schools of thoughts that Agnes will have laid out. Ioana is also going to touch upon DIY installations because it's something that came up a lot during our live conversation and I thought was really interesting to keep in the podcast. I hope you enjoy it.
There are some generic things that we found. So one of them that was really important was that whenever movements politicize these housing tensions, they tend to be split between the 2 types of tensions. So there is one type of movement that is addressing housing poverty, and it speaks about the necessity of the state to provide social housing. Usually they are not so much for home ownership because they see how the home ownership system is one of the primary causes of why these people are losing their houses. And on the other hand, you have the movements who thematize the problems of the low and middle income population to access home ownership. And these movements are more about the conditions of home ownership or the conditions how not to lose your house because of your mortgage. And we saw that it's really hard for these 2 branches of the movements to communicate or, there are efforts, but most of the times they were unsuccessful to connect the 2. And they completely correspond to bifurcation in the policies, because there is this major trend of the double post-socialist housing policies where the strong branch is state subsidy for home ownership through the market, meaning home ownership through mortgages. So this would be where they would give some state subsidy for housing mortgages, to broaden the space where the market can take care of housing. And the other branch that is getting thinner and thinner is the classic redistribution, where you just give some resources to the poor people who need it. And this is mostly about social housing, but it is getting less and less. And these 2 branches of the policy are being talked to by these different branches of the movements. So the movement about housing poverty speaks to the redistributive social branch of policy, and the movement about homeownership speaks to this state help for homeownership branch of the policy. And our conclusion was that this bifurcation in policy and in movements is a consequence of the commodification of housing, but it is a symptom it is not able to actually address the root cause of commodification, which causes this problem that you are going to have these two main types of tensions. And our main conclusion was that it is key for housing movements to try to be able to construct our own institutions, which are able to keep asking our own questions and setting up our own agendas that can address commodification, and then that don't only address the direct policy branches that are given to us by the logic of the commodification. And then another important finding of ours was that in neither of the mobilization cases, people who were affected by the problem politicized on their own. But there are always the elements of middle-class expert activists like us here who help and who do this work of translating the actual real-life problem into a political, infrastructural vocabulary that can address some sort of institution. And this shows that, we are necessary to the politicization of housing. However, it also shows that middle-class expert activists are one of the causes why housing problems are so much intimately tied to the available policy branches. And this also shows that we also need to take some kind of new direction where we can rather work for this long-term agenda of decommodification instead of just addressing the existing policy branches.
From what Agnes said, the front has been more on this side of fighting for housing rights for the most affected groups, for the more precarious groups. But in, let's say, the last 5 years, we have tried to build bridges, again, as Agnes said. So try to build bridges with the low to middle income groups. And because of that, we talked about rising housing costs. So this topic, utility costs, rising housing costs, has been around for 5 years in our group. And we have tried to ally with labor unions because they are the ones voicing the problems of low to middle income groups related to housing costs, but in wage struggles. So relating to wages. This is interesting. And also to understand from our context, utility arrears are the main form of household debt in Romania. So not credit and not rent arrears, but utility arrears for decades, like from the 90s. And in the bad years, it's over 30% of the population in utility arrears. And in the good years of high economic growth, it's around 15% of the population in utility arrears. But this hides the fact that a lot of the population is disconnected. And it's exactly, again, what Agnes said. They are disconnected. They use different kind of illegal, informal reconnection. They use wood for heating. A huge amount of the population uses wood for heating that is procured in more or less informal ways. And even, for example, water disconnections. There is a high percentage of the population with their own wells, even in urban areas. And, it's not only rural people who do this, but people in low wages. So in cities. And about the topic of renovations, we are not sure what position to take on this because isolations, renovations to reduce utility costs, they are not very well done. They are done usually with cheap materials, which affect the buildings themselves, which are not very new, as in the Hungarian case. And so this is difficult. It's a choice between something that might damage the building on the mid to long term and something that reduces your costs immediately. So it's a difficult position to take.
On the housing call, we were also joined by Eva and Jan, who are part of the European Action Coalition for the Right to Housing and the City, and by Sabrina, who's part of the European Anti-Poverty Network. I hope you enjoyed this podcast.